Hi, welcome to Talking Books and Stuff, the program that talks all about books and writing and stuff. Here's your host, Dennis Rimmer.
Welcome back. Yet another edition of Talking Books and Writing and Poetry and Stuff. Today we have with us Jade Wallace. We're recording this, by the way, on March 17th, 2023. So even if you listen to it in March 17th, 2033, it, I hope, will still be relevant. So, Jade Wallace, again, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
Now, let's go way back to the beginning. What's your early life? What was it like? Where did you grow up and go to school?
I'm actually from the Niagara region. I'm from a small town called Welland that's famous only for the Welland Canal, if it is famous at all.
Right.
And I lived there for the first 20 years of my life, moved all of 20 minutes away to St. Catharines to go to school. When I was done with that, I moved to Toronto to do yet more school and stayed in Toronto for several years, working. And then I moved to Windsor also to do school, and I'm still in Windsor and currently working again, expecting to go back to school eventually again.
Oh, okay. You might as well. I mean, there's always schools and always stuff to learn, so you might as well.
Very true.
And it's a quirk of geography, right, that Windsor is actually south of Detroit. So
it is, yes. It's one of the southernmost parts of Ontario, actually.
Right. So back at the beginning, when did you actually start writing? Right away or later on? Sorry.
Not quite right away. I spent the first 8 years not doing any writing very much. But I did start fairly early on. I was in grade 3, and they made us write poems, and I quite enjoyed being made to write poems, and then I decided to do it afterwards voluntarily. And I've basically been writing poetry since then. Sometime in my 20s, I decided to try writing fiction just because I was afraid of doing it, so I figured I'd better. And now I write poetry and fiction. The trajectory.
Right. So why? Why do you write? What do you get out of it?
Oh, probably very honestly because I was a quite lonely child, and I'm fairly lonely as an adult as well, I suppose, in some ways. I don't know that I have an easy time associating with other people in general conversation and society, and so writing feels like a very mediated way to interact with the world, I suppose. And I've always felt more comfortable reading and writing than I have, talking to people or going out and being in the world for the most part. Not that I don't do that, but writing has somehow always been a lot slower and more comfortable for me. And so I think that's probably why I gravitate towards it. It also feels like a space where it's much easier to sometimes to access the real interiority of other people than we normally get to see in daily life. So I suppose I also appreciate that about it.
And this is Jade Wallace, and we talked to her because just a little while ago showed up in the mail their first book of poetry that we know of called Love is a Place, But You Cannot Live There. So let's start right with that title. Where'd you come up with that, or how did that come about?
Yeah, that was a very roundabout way. I actually had a poem in the book, which is still in the book, and it was originally called Love is a Place That You Cannot Live There. And I was like, that's too good of a title for a short little poem. But I'd written a number of poems at that point, which sort of make up the various sections of the book. I had, the section that was about road tripping and ghost hunting. I had the section that was about going to New York with my mother, etc. And I was like, that emphasis on relationality and geography seems so well encapsulated by that phrase, love is a place but you cannot live there, that I thought that should really be the title of the manuscript. And then, of course, I wanted to change the title of the poem because it gave too much weight to the poem, which is just a really small poem in the book. And so that was how it came to be the title. But as for where I actually came up with the phrase, I'm truly not sure. I know at some point, like, the book was almost out, and I happened to come across this poem by E. E. Cummings that has the phrase "love is a place" in it. But I don't know if that's actually where I originally got it. Like, I've obviously read various E. E. Cummings poems, but I can't remember if I read that one before I came up with the title, or if that's just a coincidence.
Uh-huh.
And so, yeah, I don't, to be truthful, I do not know where the phrase itself came from. It just sort of popped into my head, fully formed, and may or may not refer to anything on purpose.
Well, that's sometimes that's the way it works. Maybe, like you said, you read it 15 years ago and it stuck there in a corner of the brain, and then suddenly it popped out and helped you get the poem done, and now it gave you a title for your poetry book called Love is a Place, But You Cannot Live There. And can maybe you tell us a little bit about your influences over the years?
Oh, sure. Well, that's an excellent question. I would have to say probably my earliest influence, although it's not a prestigious one, was when I was about 10. I was, as I mentioned, of course, when I was 8, I was, trying to write poetry and whatever. But when I was about 10, I actually realized that a lot of poetry was extremely inaccessible to me, and I didn't really understand it very well, probably because I was 10. But nevertheless, I had a little tiny spark of ambition, and I was like, I want to understand poetry better. So I was at a used bookstore one day, and I saw this anthology of poems called Good Poems, edited by Garrison Keillor, who I'm sure many people are familiar with.
Oh, yeah.
And it was this collection of just, pretty, classic authors like Charles Wright or Dana Gioia, or all these, big kind of American poets. And when I was 10, this was an extremely complex and difficult book for me to get through. When I look back at it now, the poems seem very simple. But at the time, I was quite mesmerized by them because they were so difficult for me. And so I was actually on a road trip with my parents, and I was sitting in the back of their van for, a couple of weeks at a time. We were driving every day, and I just very slowly and laboriously worked my way through the book. And I've read the book several times since then. And, I read it every few years to witness, I guess, the progression of my capabilities or whatever. And I would have to say that was one of my earliest influences. I don't feel like I necessarily write like any of the poets in the book, although I wish I wrote like Billy Collins, but that's another story. That was an early influence. And then, I went through the usual sort of phase during adolescence where I was enamored with like Sylvia Plath and Emily Dickinson and all of that, the sort of typical ones that show up in a textbook, I guess.
Yes.
But these days I try to read a bit more obscurely, I suppose, and I'm currently working one of my small gigs as a book reviews editor for CAROUSEL magazine. So I really try to absorb the more, contemporary small press literature. So I feel like that definitely has like an influence on my writing. So like an example was, I feel ever since I read Cecily Nicholson's Wayside Saying, it's just like one of those books I just cannot get out of my head because it totally changed the way I think about poetry. That's sort of how things have slowly moved.
Okay, and Jade Wallace is with us. The poetry book, it's a slim volume yet very impactful, called Love is a Place, But You Cannot You cannot live there. Who is the publisher? Because I don't know how to pronounce the name of the publisher.
Oh, yes. Guernica Editions. They are based in Ontario primarily, although they have some other activities elsewhere.
Now, it's not just poetry that you write, so let's talk about something called flash fiction. What is that?
Flash fiction would be like quite short fiction. I have written some in my day.
And I saw it on your site there of essays and reviews and fiction under your fiction heading on the Jade Wallace website.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like just quickies that you knock off for fun and more than anything. Is that kind of what it is?
Well, I suppose for me, like fiction, I don't publish nearly as often as poetry. Like I would say poetry is definitely sort of my mainstay that I continuously go back to. But I do actually have a short fiction manuscript that has been in progress for longer than I care to admit. I'm a very slow fiction writer. I just sort of peck away at it over, years and years and years. I do have a quote-unquote finished novel that I'm currently trying to find a publisher for. But yeah, the fiction it's been simmering in the background. It hasn't gotten a ton of public play. I did do a project during the pandemic, actually. The Canada Council was giving out grants to do projects where you would make the work publicly available. So I did a series of short fiction chapbooks that were available online as ebooks and also as a series of audiobooks. So you could download them and you'd hear me reading the story to you, basically. It was called Sleepless Stories. So I did that. But yeah, the fiction's there. It's just harder to find.
Okay. Again, I need to know what a chapbook. What is a chapbook? I hear the term all the time, but I don't quite know what it is.
Yeah, so chapbooks basically typically the sort of cutoff point is like less than 48 pages because 48 pages is generally how like granting bodies or traditional publishers define like a full-length book. And often the chapbooks you'll see are more informal, like they might even be sort of handmade by the writer. Mm-hmm. Or there are chapbook publishers, and so there are different ways to approach it. There's some of them are hand-stitched, some of them are like perfect bound. But they can be wonderful little art pieces, but they can also be very just scrappy, thrown together things that, you kind of use to get your work out in the world in a very accessible and affordable way. So chapbooks were definitely where my publishing career, quote unquote, started. The first things I ever published were chapbooks. That was a press in Niagara called Grey Borders Books. They are still around. They've been doing chapbooks forever.
Good. You also have some awards, and the one that intrigues me the most, Jade Wallace, is the Wergle Flomp Humour Poetry Contest.
Yes. Regrettably, I was a mere finalist for that, but I was delighted to be a finalist solely so I could put that wonderful name for a prize, Wergle Flomp, in a bio somewhere, because I just love it.
Is that actually a person, or can it be a person in one of your next books?
As far as I know, it is not a person, but I'm actually not sure where the name comes from. I should look that up.
There was a song in the 60s, which is dating me. It's by Cliff Richard's instrumental group, The Shadows, and it was the rise and fall of Flingle Bunt. So Wergle Flomp and Flingle Bunt might be cousins.
There's a
somewhere.
similar ring, yes.
So I have in my hand Love is a Place, But You Cannot Live There by Jade Wallace. I open it up to Shutter. In autumn, there is no apparent difference between tourist towns and ghost towns. Windows are shuttered, grit gathers on porches, grass pushes at every crack. And when my wife and I were reading that, we went, yeah, that's right, because we usually do our traveling in the spring and fall, not necessarily like around out to the west coast and stuff, not necessarily in the high season. And that's exactly right. Every little town we go to, it's like that. So
I think it's the best time to travel because you get a real sense of the place because you don't get sort of ensnared by tourist attractions and you're just getting to see like what the town is actually like underneath all the glitz of.
And then you can go to places like Nut and Fudge and Big Willie's and carry on like that. Another one was where is it? Where you go into the motel and talk to the manager. The Innkeeper's Curse. In Delhi, Ontario, which could hardly be less like Delhi, India, there's a woman who runs a motel out of an office that adjoins her family's apartment. That's beautiful. That's an excellent poem, and we just saw in our minds when we read it. We saw the building, the office, the desk, the people. It was just a brilliant, brilliant work of art. And I'm telling you all right now, every other poem in the book is exactly like that, if not better. But it also, according to some people, you are a Southern Ontario Gothic expert. What is that? You carry on the tradition of Southern Ontario Gothic.
I would hesitate to call myself an expert, but I am a bit of a fan of Southern Ontario Gothic. Basically, it's a literary genre. It draws on a lot of the sort of tropes of Southern Gothic from the U.S. So it's got sort of like the moral ambiguity, the, these kind of, the nebulous air of threat is constantly present among the mundane aspects of life. There's these obsessions with morbidity and death, all those kind of things, but it's specifically either by writers who are in Southern Ontario or who are writing about Southern Ontario, or often both. And having lived my entire life in various parts of Southern Ontario, and in general, just being sort of a glum and macabre person, I suppose, I was always very much drawn to that genre. And, famous writers of the genre are like Barbara Gowdy or Alice Munro, people like that.
And what's next for Jade Wallace? Now that this book is out, what do you got in your kit bag next?
Oh, gosh. Well, I'm hoping the novel.
Right.
That's the thing that's done, and I'm kind of just hoping to find a way to get it into the world. But as for other projects I'm working on, I'm actually supposed to be finishing the short story collection I mentioned earlier, which is called Echo Phenomena. I was lucky recently to get a grant to work on it, so I have to really, what's that phrase? Like, put my head down and work on it, I guess. But I've also got a bunch of collaborative work. I'm part of a collaborative writing entity called MADE, which I do with my partner, Mark Liberty. And so we co-write a lot of things, and we've got about 3 manuscripts on the go right now. We recently finished our first manuscript, which was called ZZOO, and is forthcoming with Palimpsest Press. And we've got 3 other sort of poetry hybrid collections that we're currently working on and trying to get to the finish line of. So no shortage of things to do in the near future.
Right. And do you have a regular schedule, or are your days all topsy-turvy?
Well, a regular schedule in the sense that I do have a day job that I am bound to. But around the day job, I'd say by virtue of having a day job, your days are just inevitably regimented. So, I go to work all day, and then usually I try to come home and work for a couple of hours, whether it's on my writing or Maid's writing or editing for Carousel, or I do some volunteer gigs. I do some social media stuff for Draft Reading Series. I'm on the board for Literary Arts Windsor. So there's, just all these constant tasks vaguely related to writing to do. And then I also try to get in at least a few pages of reading every day. So.
And then there's no time left for anything else.
Basically, no. Basically, I work and I write and I go to sleep.
Okay. And quickly, before we wrap it up, can you spell out your website for us so we can all get in touch with you when we hear this?
Oh, certainly. So it's jadewallace.ca, JADEWALLACE.ca.
.ca. It's as simple as it comes. And that's what works best. Simplicity is best. Jade Wallace, thank you very much for your time today, and continued good luck.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Dennis.
Thank you for visiting with us today. This is Talking Books and Stuff with Dennis Rimmer. Contact him at dennis@talkingbooks.tk. Thank you, and may all the good news be yours. Oh, and don't forget to check out his book, The Great Canadian Notebook, available across Canada and at amazon.ca.